A Poetic Pain of Loss and Love. A presentation by Matthew Hansen. The person that I chose to do my report on was Edgar Allan Poe. I chose to focus on him because he was a foundational writer in the 1800s and was the father of genres such as Gothic, horror, and mystery. Poe's life, though, was not an easy one. It was full of pain, misery, and a lot of problems. Here's a timeline of what his life kind of looked like. In 1811, Poe's mother, who was an actress, died while she was out on the road in Richmond. In 1827, Poe continued to quarrel with John Allan, who became his adopted father after his mother had died. It's at this point that Poe begins to get a gambling addiction that starts to take root in his life. In 1829, Poe's adopted mother ends up dying as well. By 1831, he has joined the army, become pretty successful, but all of a sudden, his habits catch up to him, and he gets kicked out of West Point. 1834, it is John Allan, his adopted father, who dies now. By 1836, Poe has gone to live with his aunt and his cousin, and it's at this point that he falls in love with his cousin, who's only 13 years old. They get married, and I guess they try and make it work. In 1840 through 1843, Poe really starts to get into his writing. It's at this point that he becomes quite popular. In 1846, things are looking quite bright for Poe. He's actually critically acclaimed in France and becomes a very well-known author. By 1847, his wife Virginia, that cousin of 13, she dies and leaves Poe alone. It's at this point that historians believe that Poe gets very ill out of the sadness and the sickness of losing his wife. By 1849, in the midsummer, Poe goes to Richmond to visit some of his friends. It's at this point that he, towards the fall, falls in love with his former fiancée, before his cousin, Sarah Royster, who now he becomes engaged to once again. It is after this engagement in 1849, on the 27th of September, that Poe makes a fateful decision. He chooses to leave Richmond and go visit New York. On October the 3rd, people find Poe delirious and out of it in Baltimore. It's here that they can't figure out what is going on. They take him to the hospital for medical treatment because Poe is not in his right mind. But it's at this point, 4 days later on October the 7th, that Poe ends up dying. But what is my presentation specifically about in terms of Edgar Allan Poe? I chose to focus on Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Telltale Heart. And this is what I want to believe. I believe that Edgar Allan Poe used his creation of the Telltale Heart to appease his id and process painful memories of death and guilt that he experienced in his personal life. The theory that I chose to use to analyze the id of Edgar Allan Poe was the psychoanalytic literacy theory. It has three main parts to this theory. The id, which is where we have our guilty pleasures and the things that we want. Our id requires immediate gratification, and we experience pain if we don't do this. Our ego, this is where we base things in our decision making based off of social responsibility or things that are sociably acceptable. And then we have our superego, which is used to make moral decisions. When studying the characters of Poe through this psychoanalytical lens, it gives us a new insight into the writings of Edgar Allan Poe. For example, the character of our narrator. Our narrator is a young man who lives with an older man, who is afraid of the older man's glass eye. This young character is so caught up in this that it consumes him. Why is this a big deal? Well, we saw, based on our psychoanalytic theory, that the id is what drives our passions and our desires. Here, the narrator's character has a desire to get rid of the old man's eye. His way of doing this? Easy. I'll go into the man's room when he's sleeping and kill him. Because our character's id is the driving force, his ego is not allowed to check this impulse. Normally, our ego would tell our id that we can't kill someone because it's not socially acceptable. But this character must have felt some type of traumatic experience in his past that drove his id to be stronger than his ego. His id is stronger than his ego and his superego combined. Because of this, our narrator decides for 7 days to sneak into the old man's room. When he sneaks into the old man's room for 7 days, he shines a lantern on the old man's eye. But the old man has his eyes closed for 7 days. But on the eighth day, the narrator sneaks into the old man's room, but makes a mistake. He makes too much noise, waking up the old man. They both sit there in silence for what seems like hours. But finally, the old man goes back to sleep. It's when the old man sleeps that the young man opens the lantern one more time. He sees the glass eye of the old man staring back at him. And this is the catalyst for the id of the young man to take control. With a giant scream, the young man pulls the old man out of bed, shoves him on the floor, lifts up the bed, and crushes the old man underneath. After this, the young man believes that he has finally appeased his id. He thinks he has won. But now there's a knock at the door. A police officer comes in, several of them, to ask some questions. A neighbor has heard a ruckus and a scream, and they decided to come and see what's going on. The young man is calm, for he has buried the body of the old man under the floorboards of the bed. No one will find him there. So the young man invites the police to look around. They search and search, they don't find anything. The young man is so confident that he has the police officers sit above the very boards where he has hidden the body. But it's here that we see that it is afraid, because the young man puts his own chair on top of the dead body of the old man. He's afraid that he will be discovered. It's when the police officers come that the ego starts to gain more control, for the ego chooses our social interactions, and he knows that it is socially not acceptable to murder. All of a sudden, because the ego has taken control, the superego starts to charge up. Our superego, according to the theory, is what drives our ethical and moral decisions. We start to see the young man's perception of reality distorted. He begins to hear the throbbing, beating heart of the old man through the floor. He looks around, desperately trying to figure out if the police officers can hear it as well, but they're just smiling and laughing. This smile and laugh, mixed with the heartbeat of the old man, drives the young man insane. He can't handle it anymore because his perception of reality is so messed up. It leads him to admit that he has murdered the old man and hidden the body under the floorboard. At this point, the officers take the young man to jail, and he begins to tell the story of what has happened to someone in the jail. I believe that using the psychoanalytic theory of Poe's writing, we can conclude that based on the id, ego, and superego of our narrator character, Poe has been using this character to contrast himself in the story. I believe that Edgar Allan Poe uses the narrator as a madman and not the old man because he can place his own thoughts into the narrator's head. The narrator is unnamed, undescribed. We only know that he is male. This gives Edgar Allan Poe the opportunity to place his own thoughts and his own emotions vocalized through this character. While socially, people would have considered Edgar Allan Poe mad to suggest such things, because he did it in a character within his story, it is sociably now acceptable. I believe that Edgar Allan Poe used the character of the narrator in this story to appease his id of the pains that he faced in the past, while using his ego in this story to appease his superego and his id. By doing this, Edgar Allan Poe was able to find healing through the arts that he never would have found if he had not written this story. I believe that Edgar Allan Poe used this story of the telltale heart to be an expression of the poetic pains that he faced with love in his personal life. Thank you for listening.